recorded. Great. So I want to introduce Stefania. Stefania Travagnin teaches at SOAS, the University of London. She obtained a BA and an MA in Chinese Studies from Ca' Foscari University in Venice, and a PhD in the study of religions from SOAS. And before joining SOAS, she was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture in Asia at the University of Groningen. She has done extensive field research among Buddhist communities in China and Taiwan, focusing on Buddhism and Buddhists in both in modern China and Taiwan, with main attention to three areas: modern reception history of texts, religion in Chinese societies, and concepts and methods for the study of Chinese religions. She recently co-edited 3 volumes on the concepts and methods for the study of Chinese religions, published in 2019 and 2020. She also edited a volume called Religion and Media in China, Insights and Case Studies from the Mainland, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And so currently, she is directing with myself this project, Mapping Religious Diversity in Modern Sichuan. And today, she will talk about one aspect of her research on Sichuan religions. And her talk is From the Center to the Periphery, Buddhist Discourses in Modern Neijiang. Stefania, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Yeah, I think you all see my screen. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Helena, for your very, very kind introduction. And as Helena said, we have been doing many studies of different communities in Sichuan, and I myself have been working on different sites and try to recover the heritage, the history, especially the late Qing and Republican history, rather than more contemporary or more pre-modern history of these particular sites. And I have also completed a very similar work on Xilin, for instance, and some peripheral area of Chengdu. Before I start introducing Neijiang, I want to express my gratitude to all our colleagues at Sichuan University and the Buddhist community in Chengdu that actually helped me to have a number of contacts in Neijiang, and then of course the monastics and the laity in Neijiang that helped me to arrange interviews, different research trips, and collecting material that I've analyzed, and I will, and that are the basis of some arguments that I will explain today. So now Neijiang, or Neijiang Xian, the original name was Han An, and it was also called Little Chengdu, Xiao Chengdu. It was a vibrant religious center, it still is, but if you think about the pre-1950 years, it was a vibrant religious center and hosted a significant religious population and a rich calendar of activities in the pre-modern era, and also during the late Qing and the first half of the 20th century. During this late Qing Republican period, you have 3 major traditions that appear to be extremely strong: Buddhism, Protestant Christianity, and Catholicism, with Buddhism being the earliest to appear on the territory and the most visible, and the one with the biggest impact on the territory. At least this is the kind of information that I have obtained on different archives, documents, and gazetteer. Religious life suffered a minor decline in the 1950s and right after the foundation of the PRC, and of course a major downturn with the Cultural Revolution. Right now there are several sites that followers visit for regular liturgies, and some have long rich history, and some have had the monastic resident, some have had the monastic community resident there more or less continuously. Some sites, unfortunately, they exist, but without the resident sangha at the moment. Shengshui, one of the temples that I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail today, is the major site, but not the only one. Jining is another peculiar site that is a temple was rebuilt in the 1900s by Miao Chan, this Buddhist monk, but originally was hosted a kind of very traditional temple merging the 3 teachings, the Sanjiao. And during the Japanese War, started hosting schools, and so it lost the kind of religious flavor that it had before. Then you have Ningguo Si, another temple that is called like the very first important temple of the Pashu area. And it was indeed built in the Eastern Han with the name Taichung Si, and was highly revered by the Empress Wu Zetian later on in the Tang period, who conferred the title of Puti Taochang, to be specific, site in Neijiang. Then you have Gaofen Si and Xilin Si that were male temples, but then converted into female nunneries, and they have been collaborated in the past, and they still collaborate now, locally, but also trying to reach with nunneries outside the Neijiang borders. So you see there are many, many sites with, and each of them has a kind of peculiar history. Neijiang is a remarkable religious site, yet its history and dynamics have been understudied, especially by Western scholars. Research on modern history of Sichuan Buddhism have concentrated mostly on a few actors, sites, and practices. However, an in-depth research on the history of Buddhism in Sichuan from the Qing up to the mid-20th century reveals a richer picture involving several rural and urban centers, overlapping monastic and lay networks, and a wide range of activities. And Neijiang is one of these centers. This presentation will then contribute to expand the understanding of the modern history of Sichuan Buddhism through the analysis of the case study of Neijiang in central Sichuan and the local Buddhist communities. My research will address especially the Republican era with some references also to the first decades of the PRC, the years of the Cultural Revolution, and the contemporary state. This research is based on three underlying motives that I have adopted in all my studies within the Sichuan Religious Project. One is the aim to bring the periphery to the center, then the awareness that space has an agency, and the redefinition of the criteria for eminence and the adoption of the notion of invisibility. Our overall project intends to bring the periphery, Sichuan, to the center of a study of Chinese religions. And in line with this objective, I seek within the Sichuan borders to call attention to minor or somehow understudied areas like Neijiang, small temples like Xilin Nunnery, what Xilin Nunnery is today, and marginal players like the hardly known nun Yuanhui, and bring them from the periphery to the center of the study of the Buddhist sphere. Space is another crucial underlying concept in the Sichuan project. Space here is not intended in the sense of a territory, passive container of a living society, but as a factor that facilitates the making of a community and the formation of networks. I argue that space and communities alternate each other as subject and object in the power dynamics of the religious and social landscape. This is why development and features of Buddhism in Neijiang are part, framed, and shaped by the history of Neijiang on a micro level. Monks and nuns, leaders of the local micro communities, collaborated as to create a successful network that helped Buddhism survive also the critical years of the 1950s. And of course, on a major level, is also reflect features of the history of Sichuan and the history of China in general. From a first perspective, Neijiang is also part of a network that extends to Chongqing and Luzhou. And here I am somehow adopting or follow a suggestion by a Buddhist scholar, Buddhist historian, Wang Enyang, that suggests the existence of a specific area in central and southeastern part of the province and centered around Chongqing, that was not separate at that time. And this represented, according to him, the legacy of Pa Buddhism. In my analysis will highlight how major figures and connection who are the nodes of this Republican Pa Buddhism network. And there also are, of course, related to Neijiang. So the major area should be Chongqing, Neijiang, Luzhou, and also extending somehow to Suining and Nanchong. And here the role of Wang Enyang is centrally very important. Wang Enyang is lay Buddhist intellectual. Speaking of networks, the same Wang Enyang included Neijiang in a larger education and intellectual network centered on him, a network that involves also sites in Chongqing, Nanjing, and that is related to what I've called the Sichuan-Nanjing Bridge. As the peripheral becomes central, then Buddhist players who were only marginal are recognized under a new light, and from invisible, they actually become invisible within, in bracket. Those non-eminent Buddhists may be now invisible on the national and international level, but they have been and continue to be quite visible and eminent on the more local level, conveying visibility to these communities and individuals who produce several effects. It implies then a revision of the concept of emptiness. It suggests a reevaluation of local history and memories, a revision of the history of Sichuan and then Chinese Buddhism, and the consequent repositioning of actors, sites, and paradigm. My presentation will start with an overview of the Buddhist landscape of Neijiang, with specific attention indeed on the period from the late Qing until 1950s, so to provide more data about main figures, sites, and events that form the local Buddhist scene. I will then zoom in on the elements of a unique local culture, peculiarities, key temples, and communities of Neijiang, their invisible history and protagonists, and their forming a close, strong, united community in key milestones of modern history. I will focus in particular on two Buddhist communities that became a continuous reference points locally in the Republican era, the male community at Shengshui and the male first and later female community at Xilin. The second part of my paper will expand on the local and address the texture of the Republican Path Buddhist network, as it has been, well, Wang Enyang doesn't speak specifically of the Republican period, but I'm trying to look and see the existence of this network in the years of the Republican period. So moving a little bit from the local to a wider area, but considering the idea of network as a base to define this space. And here I will unveil and explore connection exchanges between Luzhou and especially Hejiang country, Neijiang and Chongqing. And finally, the third part will consider Neijiang as participating in provincial and national narratives. So Neijiang Buddhism will then appear as participating in the Chinese Buddhist discourses from the first half of the 20th century. And a couple of examples, well, let's say three main examples that I use is the improvement of the commitment to improve Sangha education and education of the laity, and the resolution to strengthen nuns' institutional and social position, and also some strategies used by nuns to memorialize themselves within the local heritage. Now, as I summarized earlier, Buddhist temples have been prominent part of the local landscape since the pre-modern time, and let's say the most important, let's say the major moment of the very first major moment of development of Buddhism was the Tang period. And especially the late Qing and Republican period have been registered later on a booming of monasteries. The gazetteers numbered them to almost 100, an increase in the monastic community. Public monasteries appear from the end of the Ming and early Qing, the major one being Shengshui. This new development brought an increase of number of monastic temples and believers within Neijiang and in the neighboring villages, and also attracted Buddhists from outer regions to transfer to Neijiang. The Qing Republican era represent, according to the archive documents that I found, the golden age of local Buddhist history. From the late Qing up to the early 20th century, there were, and here numbers have been a little bit different from the different documents that I found, but there is the idea that there were around 200 Sangha members. There was one public monastery, Shengshui, and more than 80 temples, and 10 Nianfo Tang, the Nianfo halls for the laity. Several of these temples owned a considerable amount of land that was rented to local farmers. Each small corner of the area of Neijiang within the city walls had the temple as a center of a micro community, and many were also outside the walls in the countryside, forming another net of poles. Other sources report more or less the same quantitative data, but bringing the number of temples to more than to very much 100, a little bit more than 100, but also specifying that only 70 to 80 of them had a resident Sangha. The smaller sites hosted a couple of resident monks, while the bigger seems to have 20 monastics, except for Shengshui, who had a much larger number of monastics. And even these other sources reported that there were some Nianfo halls, Nianfo Tan, precisely for the laity. There were buildings where the laity were doing their Nianfo practice, and of course the practice were led by specific monks, so there was a supervision of the local Sangha. In total, monks and nuns in Neijiang were about 1,000 in the Republican period. The 20 years from 1912 to 1932 registered the highest number of them, and gazetteers in fact report the presence of 400 Sangha members, and an intense calendar of liturgies and other religious activities. Lay followers were numerous as well, although it is denounced that they have very little, if not none, real knowledge of Buddhism, especially at the beginning of the Republican period. Another important event in the Republican era was the local chapter of the Buddhist Association that was established between 1916 and 1917, so pretty much where a number of other local branches were built in Sichuan. The creation of this local branch helped institutionally to structure local Buddhism. And in the 1940s, you have this institute for the study of not just Buddhism and Confucianism, that was headed by Wang Enyang and hosted in Shengshui, and that certainly helped to increase the national visibility of Neijiang. The strong development registered in the late 1930s and the 1940s somehow reflects more than the outcome of the previous two decades, and will then be assessed in the following section when I discuss the regional path Buddhist network. In the late Qing and Republican era, the three monasteries of Shengshui, Donglin, and Xilin were key reference sites. In addition to these, other temples are worth mentioning for the rich history and popularity that they had. These are temples that are what also appear in local journals and Buddhist journals at that time. In the West, there was a Zishen that was built in the Song, renovated and enlarged in the late Ming. The temple, like many of them, seems to belong to the Pure Land School and hosted less than 10 months. It was partly destroyed in the 1920s, and after 1949, it turned into a secular use, so no resident monastics there. In the south, there is Longzhao, another Pure Land temple built during the Ming, where monastics and laity used to gather for large liturgies. It turned into a secular use also after 1949, and there are no resident monastics after that. In the east, you have Tafo Si, which became very popular. It was built in 1930, it was completed in 1937, and they had this Tafo, this huge Buddha statue that was actually built in 1929. It didn't have resident Sangha after 1949, but in the early 1940s, it was kind of a competitor with Shengshui because of a figure of Jianan Fashi. This monk was kind of charismatic and was attracting a lot of attention and community and monastics from outside. Also, Paoen Si, Zhuangjian, Baieng, and so on. These are all temples that appear already as very important in the Republican era. With the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the situation changed. And in the 1950s, not many Buddhist sites and monastic communities survived. The main were the male Shengshui and Xilin. Religious groups had, especially under strict surveillance from 1958, to conform to the self-governance, self-support, and self-propagation that was promoted at that time. Starting from 1951, monastics in part disrobe and in part join work in the fields, and thinking in quantitative terms. Quantitative terms, there were still 71 temples in the 1950s, so a little bit less than before, but there were quite some of them. However, soon, 58 of these 71 temples turned into something else, assuming a different and non-religious function, and only 13 survived. In 1956, only 41 monastics, 14 monks and 27 nuns, with only 5 of them managing actually temple affairs, have remained in the territory. And by 1959, they were somehow absorbed into the labor sector, either working in the local fields or in some shoe factories. The Cultural Revolution brought and also material damage, and with the destruction of several of the sacred sites that we have some memories from the past. In the 1980s, Buddhist activities have slowly restarted. In the 1983, there were 16 monastics, 3 monks and 13 nuns living in temples. Today, the monastic population has increased, although it has not reached the number that they had and the amount that, and the quantitative amount that we found 100 years ago. If we want to go and look into more detail and see what kind of, let's say a little bit the history of 3 of these communities that appear as the central communities, not the only ones, as you have just heard from the list of the other temples, but certainly very central in the Republican era. So I'm going to say a little bit about these temples and then how they also managed to be a community and collaboration that happened in the 50s and early 60s in a critical moment of the history of Buddhism in Neijiang, and how they joined forces to help the survival of local Buddhism. So we will start with Shengshui Monastery. The first building were completed during the Tang, the late 9th century, and was actually named Shengshui Sinzi, the reference to Shengshui, holy water, or sometimes also called Linchuan spiritual spring, was due to the spring from the hill behind the temple. That is also part of the monastic complex, and now is kind of gated, and is a destination of local pilgrimages, and it's one of the places that I was shown when I arrived. There is the idea that there is this water that is continuously flowing in for more than 1,000 years, and continuously, and that is water that is somehow come from the Tuozhan of the area. One monk in the Tang period was facing this water and meditating there for 3 years, and then reach enlightenment. And to remember these events, they built a temple around it. So this is why it's called Shengshui. The temple was expanded during the Song and renamed then Sinzi Changsi, and more expansion during the Ming, especially in the 15th century, and then the Qing, and so on. Buildings from the Ming and the Qing period are still extant today. And there is also a male face Guanyin statue from the Tang in the Guanyin Tian. There is also a stone bridge from the Ming period that is still visible. Today, the temple hosts a small sangha with an abbot that is also very active in creating lectures and a number of liturgies. Before 1949, the temple hosted more than 120 monks, and in certain moments, the monastic community increased to 380 monks, according to some documents that I found. Shengshui has been one of 8 major zonling in Sichuan, and the most important, but certainly the first one, according to most of the sources, in central Sichuan. Sichuan monks like Zhang Xue from the 17th century, and then Qingde from the 20th century were very active there. And Zhang Xue was actually native of Neijiang, then very much active in Chengdu, so in other areas of Sichuan, but he's native of Neijiang, and something that Neijiang is very proud of. In the Republican period, Shengshui had strong connection with other zonling in Chengdu, and also Guangde Monastery in Suining, and this collaboration with Suining is still kind of cardinal today. After the Cultural Revolution, years of lack of religious activities and very few resident monks, only 4 in 1979, and severe damages to fire, the year 1982 marked the rebirth for the temple and the community. With only 3 resident monks, Shengshui Monastery started liturgies and activities, and also in the early 1980s, the site was also defined as a cultural relic and a crucial example of local heritage for being the first public monastery in central Sichuan. I have here some photos, so you will see this is the water, the spring that are still part of the temple, and is where this monk was meditating and then reached enlightenment. And now is a place where you go. You can, of course, also use the holy water. This is me with one of the laity that helped me to explore Shengshui. This is the famous bridge from the Ming period. Sorry. Now, I have another photos in another slide with that you can see the Guanyin Tian, that there is also this statue of Guanyin, still a very old statue of Guanyin with a male face. Moving to the other 2 temples is Tonglin and Xilin, but seems to be, was life as being quite interconnected. So the history of Xilin and Tonglin, they were built one in front of the other with the Tuozhan, with the river in between. There were male temples with a small community of about 10 monks each in the early Republican period. And what is interesting here is how Xilin in 1938, so towards the end of Republican era, but also in a kind of particular time, it was the time of the Sino-Japanese conflict, was renovated and turned into a female monastery, and is now one of the major female monastery in Neijiang. And there is this Yuanhui that has been extremely important in make that a success. Tongling was a Pure Land temple, again, built in the Tang, and was known as Dongjingsi. It was located very close to the Thousand Buddha rocks, these cliff statues carved during the time of the Song. So the temple was object of several visits because of these wonderful statues. However, it was then enlarged during the Ming, especially in the late 16th, early 20th century. In the final years of the Ming, it was partly destroyed and then rebuilt during the Qing. Unfortunately, in 1942, during the Sino-Japanese conflict, Tongling was bombed by the Japanese, and buildings and several statues disappeared. However, in 1948, Zhu Shoupeng, that was an official from the Qing period and then also quite active in the Republican period, decided to collect donation and to reopen a part, at least in part, Tonglingsi. And so now some of these statues are still, carved statues are still visible. Tonglingsi, very, very recently, actually in July 2021, started rehosting offices of the local Buddhist association. So it seems that is bringing back to life very, very recently. Xilin was again a male monastery, built in the Song in the 13th century, then refurbished in the early 14th century. And also during the Ming, especially in the middle of the 16th century, it was rebuilt as a two temples. So one above the hill and the other one below the hill. It was partly destroyed in the Ming, and then it was reconstructed during the Qing. And it was quite a large, so it was at the end of the 18th century, it was quite a substantial temple built in two different sites. And at that time, facing the other side of the river, Tonglingsi. At the beginning of the Republican era, the two temples will start being reduced drastically, and due to financial constraints, the resident monks have to sell both land and precious objects from the sacred site. As I said before, all these temples were actually owning quite a huge amount of the local territory. In 1938, this nun, Yuanhui, who somehow has been practicing at the neighboring Tonglingsi, succeeded after quite a substantial fundraising to get Xilin from the resident Sangha with a certain price. And then she decided to turn this male temple into a place for practice for nuns. Of course, the two parts of the temples were reduced to only one, and which is the temple that you're going to see, you see also today when you visit. After the Cultural Revolution, and the very beginning, Yuanhui seems to be quite a charismatic nun that attracted women to become ordained and reside at Xilin. So the female monastic community in Xilin in the late 1930s and early 1940s was quite numerous. After the Cultural Revolution, of course, the nunnery had to be rebuilt and reopened, and they restarted some liturgies already in 1976. From 1982, when it was fully reopened, the nunnery organized a number of Guanyin liturgies yearly. And according to the resident nuns, these liturgies are attracted a number of these new huge crowds and more disciples. So it seems that it's going back to be a central area, at least locally, a central site, at least locally, like it was at the time of Yuanhui. Nuns said that actually not even before 1949, there were all these Dharma liturgies. Since the Republican era, the conversion into a nunnery, the temple was formed of three main halls, let's say three main sections. There was the first hall that had the 4 guardian kings, the statue of Maitreya and Weituo, then the second hall with the main shrine hall and a shrine with 3 Buddhas, and on the back, the representation of the Western Pure Land, and then a third hall where with the Guanyin hall. And the interest is this Guanyin Tian. Before there was a Wenchan Tian, so it was a shrine for Wenchan that now doesn't exist anymore. The 3 halls have been repaired partly and enlarged, and there is now a huge Nianfo hall that hosts 200 or 300 people that are used for the main liturgies. The nunnery is still a reference point for the local community. And there are around 20 nuns, some fully ordained, some waiting for the final stage of the ordination, some different ages, and some of them are also not living in the temple because they're seeking education outside. In the 1996, the Neijiang city government has defined Xilin as a local heritage and so under protection. I have here some images. This is from Tolin to show you an example of his carved statues, and part of them are still visible. This is a photo of this huge Nianfo Tang that has been built in the early 21st century. Then two images of the main shrine hall of Xilin. And then here, this is this stele that is, as you see, is very ruined, so it's very difficult to get much out of it. But it was part of the Wenchan Tian, so it was part of the altar for Wenchan that was located where now you have the Guanyin Tian. And on the other side, there is this body tree that is quite big, and the nuns like to show them as to show it to all the visitors as a sign of the real Buddhist identity of this temple. But speaking of identity, what is very interesting here is not just a male temple turning into a female Buddhist temple, but also a temple with the presence of other tradition like the Wenchan Tian. The Wenchan Tian was there already when there was a male temple, and just outside there are these small shrines where people actually still burning incense for the local deities. So again, it's a Buddhist temple, but within the traditional religious diversity and plurality that you find in China. And this is Yuanhui, this nun that was successful in rebuilding the temple Xilin as a female nunnery. What is very important when it comes to her, and she was extremely charismatic. And in the next section, when I talk about Buddhist education, I also say something about the initiative for educating nuns that she had. But she became also very relevant and mentioned in sources in the 1950s and 1960s. So she left Neijiang for a few years, but then came back in the early 1950s. And that's when she joined efforts with Shen Wen, the abbot of Shengshui, and they tried to make sure that they were representative of the Buddhist Sangha and the religious community in talks to the local government, and make sure that Buddhism was not disappearing. So they were really trying to still maintain it as a monastic community at Neijiang at that time. These years, Shengshui has only 12 resident monks. 2 of them left for elderly homes very soon, and the others, most of the other, try to disrobe nonetheless. While in Xilin, 1951, only 2 nuns were resident there. But then when she came back in 1952, she was able to attract several women and to have 10 extra nuns in those years. So she was, as I said, very active in keeping talks to the local government and make sure that the monastic community was not disappearing. And in 1954, they started working more closely with the local government. In 1962, they participating in the Sichuan Free Teachings Representative Committee. Nonetheless, from the very late 1950s, but especially in the 1960s, many of these monastics actually disrobed, and then there was the Cultural Revolution. But it's important to see the kind of sense of belonging to a community that there was at that time. So a sense of belonging that implies also monks and nuns collaborating together. Now I'm gonna pass to an analysis from the analysis of Neijiang as sustained space to Neijiang as part of a different other space, the so-called Pa-Buddhism network. So Wang Enyang analyzed the development of Buddhism in Sichuan, saying that the development reflects 3 cultural domains. There is the cultural sphere centered around Chengdu, and that includes the western part of the province and places like Chengdu, Leshan, and Meishan. And this is the legacy of Shu Buddhism. Then there is a second area centered around Chongqing, so the southern and eastern part of the province, which includes places like Chongqing, Neijiang, and then also Far East like Luzhou, And this is the legacy of Pa Buddhism. And then there is a third area that extends around the Tibetan Buddhist community in representation of Tibetan Buddhist practices. So this assessment frames Buddhism in Chongqing with their local monastery communities and institutes so closely connected with what was happening also in Luzhou and Hejian, and also with the local networks in Neijiang, and somehow going a little bit further to Suining. So it's a common shared space which hosted a network of monastics and lay intellectuals, a shared space that facilitated a synergy among these Buddhist actors. The synergy assumed its major moment precisely in the late 1930s and early 1940s. This was also due to the Sino-Japanese conflict and the subsequent relocation of governmental offices, military academies, and intellectual minds from Nanjing to Sichuan. Mostly Chongqing, but not just limited to Chongqing. Those were the most successful years of the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist Institute in Chongqing and the years of development of the Sichuan branch of the Chinese Metaphysical Institute that was from Nanjing, but then moved to Tianjin, so near and part of Chongqing. The time in which, this was the same time in which Wang Enyang opened the Institute for the Study of Eastern Culture and Education, the Dongfang Wenjiao研究院 in Neijiang, in 1942. Going to Luzhou, these were the years of big expansion of Fawansi, this temple in Hejian County, and then near Luzhou. It was planned and opened in 1941. And again, you see there a number of monastics that were also active in Chongqing, either the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist Institute or in the Chinese Metaphysical Institute, and going there. And when I was visiting Fawansi in Hejian, the abbot actually suggested that it was precisely because it was close to Chongqing and Neijiang that it was Fawansi was able to attract a number of intellectual minds, monastic and intellectual minds, and to open this great Foshueyuan Buddhist Institute. So you have Taishu that was in Sichuan at that time, becoming an honorary dean, eminent monks like Inshun and Yanpei in charge of the curriculum of the teaching. And Inshun is this important monk that then moved to Taiwan and became the kind of founder of Renjian Fuzhao in Taiwan. And it was at that time that Inshun got the title of Tao Shi, a title that he kept afterwards, after he left Sichuan. Then you have a number of other teachers that are listed there that are all coming from these different towns, but this particular part of Sichuan. Because there were these eminent minds, there are a number of monks and other teachers from Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Guangdong also decided to move to Fawansi. There were a number of, this institute opened a number of classes. There was a more elementary one, the advanced one. So it was quite very well structured. And this is when the monk Inshun delivered a number of lectures as teaching lectures. And those lectures became important texts, like his text on India, in Tuje Fojao, the very first book he wrote, also controversial book he wrote on Indian Buddhism, but other books on Madhyamika that he published were all coming up from lectures that he gave here. So these institutional communities have been built around a clear group of Buddhists who were present throughout the years. Their teaching activities and scholarly production is another identity marker of the area and the active network that they form and foster. Wang Enyang committed to teach also in Neijiang because he was in Chongqing at that time, in Jianjing more precisely. And so it seems that really the common area was creating this kind of hub, and Chongqing was probably the major hub where the different exchanges had started. This was not just, as I explained, a network on teachers that were involved in teaching the Sangha, but we're also dealing with intellectuals and scholar monks that produce a number of publications. Wang Enyang produced volumes during his activities, in some of them in Nanchang, but mostly during the activities in Neijiang. Inshun, as I said, many of his most important works have been drafted through the lectures he gave when he was in Hejian. So it's not just the networks of activities for a few years, but the kind of scholarly production still remains as an important part of the history of Chinese Buddhism. those were also the same years where you have a number of other monastics like Changyuan or Piannan that were extremely active in Sangha education. And Piannan is this monk that, together with Wang Enyang, the lay intellectual Wang Enyang, I remember as key teachers during the late Republican period, and then in case of Piannan also later on, after the Cultural Revolution. The presence also of other poles indicated that this particular network was also interactive with other centers and forming then a kind of different connections, so networks connected with other networks, and a kind of interconnection and exchanging among networks that form a plurilayer structure of communities. It is, and because of these examples, of course, there are also other examples that can be used to show strong connections between the different areas in the Buddhist network, as Wang Enyang, this is the name that Wang Enyang has coined. I use especially these particular Buddhist institutes because Buddhist institutes was a way also to attract young scholars, young monks, and to have a scholarly production. But it's very important then to think of Sichuan as made of separate spaces, each of them with a sustained local community and local life. But then these small spaces are part of regional or cross-regional networks, and all these different major networks are also interacting. So this is one of the reasons why this specific project, not just my studies, but this specific project on Sichuan religions, try to use more and more the idea of networks. I've made a map here just to show you. This is a map of contemporary Sichuan, but and Chongqing. I have to include Chongqing, but just to show you how close these sites actually were. Now, moving from, we have discussed a little bit Neijiang as a space, then Neijiang as part of the Buddhism network. But now I want to show you how what was happening in Neijiang was also a reflection of what was happening in other parts of China. So when we think about these local communities, we should also think that we're participating in regional and national discourses. I'm going to use two major examples. One is the renewal of Sangha education, mostly because most of my research has been done on Foshui Yuan or other schools for the Sangha. And then I'm going to look at something that I found in different nunneries in Sichuan, the way that nuns try to memorialize their own history. When it comes to the renewal of Sangha education and starting from Neijiang, we found a number of texts that actually are claiming that monastics and the laity were not really knowledgeable about Buddhism. It was this one particular article from 1946, there were the nuns said that Neijiang Buddhism was starting a sort of revival, but it needs to have more, a Fuxin, a revival. And it was the responsibility of every Buddhist in Neijiang to do so. And the very first way to do so was to create a better education, Buddhist education. And this was the time where everywhere in China, not just in religion and not just in Buddhism, but also in the public sphere, you have a renewal of education system. When it comes to the Sangha, you have, when it comes to the Buddhism, sorry, you have three different forms of instruction. The education for the Sangha, so the Sangha training, the Sangha teaching the Dharma to the laity, or also Sangha organizing non-religious learning for the community. And then lectures to the militaries and troops, and this especially before or during the Sino-Japanese conflict. When I think about Sichuan and on the basis of the studies that I've done, I would divide the history of Buddhist education into four main phases. One is the late Qing period and the early Republican period until the 1920s, the 1930s, and the late Republican era. Just to go very quickly on these points, the late Qing show the beginning of the Xuetang and the Sang-Xuetang, so the Sangha study halls, with a renewal of the curricula. And it was also the beginning of a very strong Sichuan-Nanjing exchange. And the monk Xueten became extremely important because he visited Yuanhui, got inspired by it, and discussed the possibility to open, to renew education for the Sangha and for the Buddhist laity in Sichuan. You have more and more schools opening with the very first years of the Republican, of the Republican period. The Huayan School at Baoguansi, at the outskirts of Chengdu, is an example, but also the Wenshu Yuan in Chengdu in 1920s opened another school. You have a number of them are called Foshui Yuan, but we should not think of this Foshui Yuan as big as other Foshui Yuan, like the Minnan Foshui Yuan or the Wuchang Foshui Yuan. They are quite less ambitious when it comes to structural curricula. And there were also this kind of early Foshui Yuan were lasting a few years also, and mostly for financial constraints, a shortage of students, and of their teacher, they were moving to other areas. In the third phase, the 1930s, you have the foundation of more solid and certainly more longer term Foshui Yuan. And this is towards the end of the 1930s with the Sino-Japanese conflict, the move of a number of schools and also Buddhist intellectuals to Sichuan and Chongqing. You have then the Chinese Metaphysical Institute moving there, as I said. So the moving of the center from Chongqing, from Nanjing to Sichuan and Chongqing was certainly inducive to recreate and renew Buddhism in those areas. There is the so-called Sichuan-Nanjing exchange that was starting already in the late Qing, got in a new stage and wrote a new chapter in those years. And then there are the final years, the 1940s. And the 1940s very often are defined in other texts as the period of decline. But if we look at the kind of Buddhist evolution and development that we see, especially in the Neijiang, Chongqing, and that particular area, it seems that something might have been declining, but there were also signs of new beginnings. So that there is quite of the creation of new centers. So the centers were moving to different areas of Sichuan and not and declining in other areas of Sichuan. I want to go back to Neijiang and show you how almost, let's say, I have evidence of Buddhist schools from the second, third, and the fourth period that I've listed here. And so to show how Neijiang was actually following what was happening in the rest of Sichuan and Nanjing. Now, the very first school is the Fokua Xuexiao, was located within the temple, within Shengshui. And we see here how Shengshui is really a kind of leading center for these different education activities. Started in February 1929, fees and financial support came from the local branch of a Buddhist organization and includes 2 levels of learning, like many other schools. So you have a more beginner and an advanced learning of Buddhism. And teaching was offered to both monks and the laity. A few years later, the abbot of Shengshui, the monk Peng Yang, opened and managed the Linzhou Foshui Yuan in the open from 1936 to 1940. And the institute was also located within Shengshui, which then became also known as Linzhoushan. After the closure of this institute, you have another structure of learning, the Tuojiang Foshui Yanzhoushi, that was open next to a temple, in a public park of Neijiang, very next to a very small temple that has been abandoned in the Republican period. It was a very short term. There was not much on the history of this temple, but he said that this seems to be the predecessor of the later Institute for the Study of Eastern Culture and Education that was founded by Wang Enyang in Shengshui. According to sources, Wang Enyang was actually invited to continue the Tuojiang Buddhist Society. But Wang Enyang decided that the name was not appropriate and was not reflecting his own ideas of ideal education, not just Buddhist education, but he was including Buddhist education in a larger conception of education. It was not big enough, so he declined that offer, but he decided to open another institute, the Dongfang Wenjiao Yanzhong Yuan, at Shengshui. It was opened in 1942, stayed at Shengshui until 1947, and afterwards, because the space was not enough space within the temple, Wang Enyang moved the institute to Chengdu, where he stayed open until 1951. Then you have also the Neijiang Buddhist Society, this where in different locations in Sichuan, there was a place where monks were lecturing the laity, but also monastics could go and listen to these different lecture series. Not just initiative for monks and laities or monastics in general and laity, you have Yuanhui, but here is also protagonist in the late 1930s, as soon as she opened Xilin as a Buddhist nunnery. She also established the Aitao Foshui that was precisely for the education of nuns. And she's remembered for, as I said, she was kind of charismatic figure, and she invited a number of learned monks from Paoguangsi, for instance, this very important temple in Xintu, so near Chengdu, to go and lecture and give lectures on particular sutras. It lasted just a few years. There was not much activities when it comes to nuns education in the late 40s and the 50s and 60s, but in the 80s, before her passing, she even opened a very short term for Yuan. So there was still this big emphasis on improving education. There is not much research ongoing on Wang Enyang, and unfortunately, I don't have much time to say too much about him, but I will summarize. Wang Enyang there's not much research in Western scholarship about Wang Enyang. He's always remembered as a Buddhist intellectual or a Yogacara mind. But he was quite a complex character. He was born in Nanchon. He studied in Beijing at the beginning, Western philosophies, but also under Liang Shuming. So he was studying not just Western philosophy. And then he moved to Nanjing when he was very active in the China Metaphysical Institute with Ouyang Jinbu. He went back to Nanchon, to his own hometown, where he built the Guishan Academy that lasted quite a few years. And this was a Shu Yuan, and he used the term Shu Yuan just to remind the kind of traditional Confucian academies. And over here, he was teaching not just Confucian classics, but he was including also Buddhism and some Buddhists, especially Yogacara and Madhyamika texts in the lectures. After that, he moved to, he was active in Jianjing, so Chongqing, but it's not so far from Nanchon, because the Chinese Metaphysical Institute moved there, as I said, and then he became very active in Nanjing. He finished his career in Beijing, in the Zhongguo Foshui Yuan, so it also was very important in the context of the Chinese Buddhist Academy, but until 1961, more or less, and then he went back to Sichuan and he died in 1964. He was a great educator, but also a great theorizer of education. So he wrote two major manifestos of his education. One when he was at Guishan Academy, and the other one that is called the Guishan Shupanji. And this is a manifesto of his view on what education should be, and reflects his motivation to start schools and engage in teaching. But then later on, he published another one about that's called Zhao Yu Geming Lu. So again, the idea of Geming, of the importance of reforming education, was published a little bit later on, and reveals some more mature reflection on the contemporary system of education and on the teaching of which culture. So the teaching of Chinese Eastern culture vis-a-vis the teaching of Western culture. Wang Enyang was teaching not just here, but he was also very active and was invited to Chengdu, also Leshan, and is very much remembered by many communities even today. He was also, and this is something that I wrote in my work on Xuening, he was called to Xuening in this Buddhist school that was opened by the Buddhist nun Changwei, and to give a series of lectures. It was 1945, so it was not really a great time for China, and also for Xuening. It was a kind of also poor years, but yet Buddhist education, or education about Buddhism, so not just education for the Sangha, was seen as important and essential if you want to not just improve self-cultivation, but it was more you need to improve Buddhist education and the knowledge of education in order to rescue Zhouguo, to rescue the country, to rescue the world. And he gave a 1 week lectures on the Heart Sutra at that time. Given the time, I'm gonna Yes, I'm gonna say just a few extra words about the Tongfang Wenjiao Yanzhou Yuan, which is the major place, well, it's the place of Neijiang, and being this a talk of Neijiang, I really wanted to say a little bit more of the name and what he planned to do that. As I said, he was active there for Wang Enyang for 5 years. Then he left, he wrote 2 pieces on his goodbye to Shengshui as a temple and a goodbye to Neijiang as a place. And in these 2 short pieces is actually summarize very well the richness of the area and the important history of a temple. The Dongfang Wenjiao Yanzhou Yuan has a very interesting name, if you like. Wang Enyang was very concerned about going back to culture and education of Eastern of Asia, and most importantly China in his mind. So the Wen that you find here is from Wenhua culture, and Jiao is from Jiaoyu education. So it doesn't reflect the term religion. What he organized was 4 different kinds of programs. There was the classical 2, so the more preliminary program that lasted 4 years, that was mostly about Buddhism and Confucianism, and also some other elementary teaching. And then you have the Yanzhou Pu, the research program, which graduates from university or an equivalent degree, or people who have graduated from the other more elementary program could actually enroll. Student numbers were not set, were not limited, there was no cap number at that time. But then, because more than 70 students seems to have enrolled, there was a problem with the space, so they tried to cap the number to not more than 10 per each year. And precisely because the number was increasing, he decided at a certain point to move it to a larger space in Chengdu. Most of the fees, so monastics have all fees waived. If you were a student of the Yanzhou Pu of the research institute, also meals and accommodation were provided, but the other programs, meals have to be sustained by the students. Besides these 2 major programs, you have other 2 minor programs. One was a kind of post-academic programs that was focusing a lot of also on practice, Confucian self-education and Buddhist self-education. But then there was the distant learning program, not on Zoom, of course, more a kind of correspondence program for whoever wanted to learn about Confucianism and Buddhism in the way that Wang Enyang had conceptualized education, but were not residing in Neijiang or nearby. And there were quite some fees to pay in that case, including the postage. So on the post, there were the so-called textbooks or writings that these students by correspondence had to learn, have to study. And these textbooks were actually all the volumes that Wang Enyang was producing, the so-called Wenjiao Congkan, that were produced, that then were published separately from 1945 to 1949. So it was one volume, and then you have the Tongfang Wenjiao Congkan, Zhongshu, sorry, in 25 volumes. So all the different lectures that Wang Enyang was giving, and then they were revised and they were included into this publication, but that now can be found very easily on the Republican and databases that we have. And they were mostly commentaries on Confucianism and Buddhism, so very good and then in line with the kind of education that he wanted to offer to China at that time. So again, this is not just a place for learning, was a place, the production of knowledge that remain the same way that all the books that were produced in the other part of the Buddhist network have been preserved. So in both Guishan and Neijiang, Wang Enyang wanted to combine the teaching of Buddhism and Confucianism and say that the mission was to return the main attention to Buddhism and Confucianism as key cultures of China. Confucianism, all the classics, and Buddhism was mainly / mostly Yogacara and Madhyamika texts. This was not just something, so this idea of Ru Fo Wei Zong, so the Buddhism and Confucianism as pillar for education. This was not just his mind, was not just in his mind, but was in line with his perspective on culture. So this was in line with his overall perspective on culture and education, but also legacy of what was happening during the May 4th movement, reaction to the adoption of Western thought at the expenses of their own Chinese national cultural identity. And indeed, there were a number of other initiatives in those years that were precisely not denying the importance of Western knowledge, but kind of calling for also giving attention to Chinese culture and the importance to keep both, and especially the importance to remind how helpful Chinese culture could have been to the entire world. So you have the Research Institute of Eastern Culture, the Dongfang Wenhua研究院, which was opened in Wuchan by Tan Taiyuan. And this is another example, also very similar when it comes to the name, to what Wang Enyang had planned. So Wang Enyang was part of a national discourse on changing idea of what was important culture and important education. So he decided that we have, on one hand, you have Chinese culture, on the other, Eastern culture is how he called it. On the other hand, you have Western culture, but it was important to create a new culture and education, a new system, in addition to, but an external to, but also comprehensive of the two systems of Eastern and Western culture. A new system, a new plan that he wanted to implement in schools that he was either founding or teaching in. This is the further new system that Wang Enyang encouraged not just China, but the entire world to pursue. So at that time, the call was not just the Chinese intellectual, but China tried to be really a global player and discussing as a global actor. This was the only way to reach a fruitful and peaceful future for all. The need of a new culture and to build also a new sense of humanity, and the new culture had to be based on a compassing and merging Chinese and non-Chinese past and present traditions. So he has this idea, and I repeat very often, to 融合 or 融合 the Zhongwai, so Chinese and non-Chinese, Gujin, present and past. One of the mottos of the Institute was finding peace, offering peace to humanity, and the revival of the Minzu, of the nation. The first one, he said, you know, we study so much European culture, but we have to say China is way bigger than Europe. And at the same time, Europe is, it seems that Europe is fighting, we are in the 40s at that time. So he's looking at Europe as a place with many fights, as probably a place with a culture that was leading to division among nations and fights among nations. Well, actually, if you look at the local Chinese culture, he says, there is a more integrated balance in there. There is the idea of the unity under Tianxia, under on earth. And this is something that he found emphasized in Chinese culture, and probably not emphasized enough in Western culture. And he also said, if you want to build a new nation, if you want to rescue the nation, rescue the world, it's very important that you that you revive the idea of nation, the idea of nation in the sense of the national culture. So the idea to revive the national culture seems his mission and aspiration, and became also the mission and aspiration of the future of the Institute in general. And here I have just some photos that you see. This is the place, it's the Guanyin and Shengshui, where the Dongfang Wenjiao Yanzhou Yuan by Wang Enyang was located. And right now, of course, it's not an institute anymore. And there are also these very old statues of Guanyin. And these are some photos of the place where the Aitao Buddhist Society, opened by Yuanhui in the late 1930s, early 1940s, for nuns, and then later on became the place of the Foshui Yuan in the early 1980s, also for nuns. Just say just a few words of the last point that I wanted to touch as what I call memorialization strategy is something that I've noticed in different nunneries. So we are back to nuns, the importance to strengthen nuns, but also the way of nuns to have their own heritage memorialized. So what I've noticed in a number of nunneries in Chengdu, and also mostly in Chengdu, like Jinshan'an or Zhongxingsi, was the idea to have these kind of rooms with images or photos of different monastics, most of them resident of the temples, but also not just resident monastics, but also other monastics that somehow have contributed to the temple, contributed to the development of the temple, have resided in the temple. And so somehow, because maybe authoritative figure, they give some importance to the temple. So the idea to build a sort of identity of that particular temple, or a temple community, that went a little bit beyond the walls and the gates of that particular temple. Something very similar, I found it in Xilin in Neijiang, and here you have a number of photos of nuns, and the central one that you could see here is indeed Yuanhui, the first nuns of Xilin. But like the other temples, these nuns were, some of them, they actually have lived there. So then it's not just the list of abbesses, it's not just the list of the most important nuns, are the list of some nuns, also are the images of some nuns, resident of Xilin, are the images of other nuns that lived or stayed or visited Xilin. And somehow Xilin wants to include them into their own sort of identities. It's a kind of Xilin community, or you may call it network as well. I use the term community in this case. Of course, this is not just something that I found in Sichuan. I found it in a number of nunneries in Sichuan, but I also remember the case of the Fuhuita in Taiwan, where you have in the Fuya, part of the Fuya Jinshi that was opened by Yinshun in Hsinchu. And over there you have the images of some monks that have been active there, and also other monks that maybe have never been there, but somehow are related in one way or another and are made part of the identity of that particular place. But this way to picture history is something that has been extremely interesting for me to explore. And I was very happy that I could find a case study in Neijiang as well. So to conclude, Neijiang is where a Buddhist nun, Yuanhui, excelled as a leader, and she was praised by also other more central Buddhist cycles. She was also very much praised by nuns like Long Lian, for instance. Neijiang is where another page of the history of nuns community unfolded in a distinctive way, but also partaking or joining wider narratives. Neijiang is also where Shengshui became reference for Chan practice and attracted monastics from outside. Neijiang is also where the modern history of sound education wrote an important page, and Wang Enyang and his institute for the study of Eastern culture and education is an added element. And Neijiang is part of this Republican Buddhist network. So my presentation today tried to summarize my research on a small site, one of the many in Sichuan so far understudied. And I suggested a shift of attention to local communities in less known places, while at the same time also encouraged to analyze local patterns in their critical engagement with wider narratives, so with elements that you find also larger Sichuan or in China, but also encourage the way to look at particular sites as belonging to one network or to more networks. This is how I argue unheard stories and histories of religion can also be recollected and remembered. And invisible protagonists like the nun Yuanhui are not invisible anymore, but become more visible to also members of communities outside Neijiang. Such research perspective can generate more and different historical memories, reposition the peripheries to the center, and revive a lost heritage. And of course, this is part of my research. It's just the very first, some of the results of my research is in Neijiang. And I will continue my research to try to add in and integrate in this picture with more community. I aim to try to find more connection between Shengshui Xilin and the other temples that I just listed quite quickly in this presentation. And of course, I'm also very looking forward to find more about popular practice of Buddhism that and kind of Minjian Fojiao and local practices that have been very present in the Republican period and are still present today. And finally, I'm very looking forward to collaborate with other members of the Sichuan project, and in a way also to see how they've been studying other traditions placing in Neijiang in order to have not just the Buddhist discourse of Neijiang, but create a religious discourse of Neijiang. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stefania, for an incredibly full talk and full of insights that will need a lot of unpacking. And I know that you're working on several different publications based on this research. So it's very exciting.